Warning: non-consensual sleeping situations discussed. In the kitchen, Susie's donuts sat untouched, sugar already sinking into grease, and Susie leaned against the counter and let herself feel it all: love, fear, envy tangled together just like their hands. Susie lingered in the hallway longer than she meant to, that thought circling her mind until it softened something sharp inside her. If she hadn't known them since scraped knees and shared secrets, if she hadn't watched them at Brown in a way no one ever questioned, she would have sworn this was fate. The kind people write poems about, the kind that doesn't ask permission or make sense. Soulmates, she thought, the word landing quietly, not lovers, not the clean, easy version people understood, something older, something messier. Two lives stitched together so early that even distance couldn't find the seam. She'd seen Tate with lovers, charming, distant, always holding a piece of himself back. She'd seen Noah try to love other people too, careful and kind, like he was borrowing a feeling that didn't quite fit. But with each other, there was no performance, no effort, just gravity. Maybe that was why it hurt them so much. Soulmates weren't always meant to be happy together. Sometimes they were meant to witness each other, to shape each other, to stay even when staying costs more than leaving. Susie exhaled slowly. Maybe that's it, she murmured. Maybe that's what you are. She looked once more at the closed bedroom door, at the quiet holding its breath behind it. Whatever name you gave it, friendship, love, damage, devotion, it was real, and it was rare. And maybe, she thought, wiping her eyes and picking up the cold coffee mug, that kind of soulmate was the hardest one to survive. Susie stayed where she was, leaning against the wall as if she moved too much she might break the moment just by breathing wrong. She'd seen devotion before. It was usually obvious, grand gestures, chasing, someone loving harder than the other. But here, she couldn't tell, not even standing this close, not even knowing them as well as she did. Tate held Noah like he was afraid of waking up alone again, like his body had decided the argument was over even if his mouth never would. There was desperation in the way he clung, in the way his thumb brushed the same spot on Noah's hand over and over, as if reassurance could be worn into the skin. But Noah stayed. He didn't pull away, he didn't untangle his fingers even though he was awake enough to know what this meant. His face was calm, almost resigned, like someone who had already accepted the cost and paid it anyway. Loving. Without hope was its own kind of devotion, and Susie knew that. It was quieter, it didn't beg. Who was more invested, the one who couldn't let go or the one who never had? Susie's throat tightened. If she only had her eyes to judge by, she would have said Tate loved harder, but love wasn't always about intensity. Sometimes it was endurance. Sometimes it was being the one who stayed soft after being hurt, the one who didn't demand proof anymore because asking had stopped helping. They were balanced in the worst way, each carrying a different half of the same ache. Tate is afraid of losing Noah. Noah is afraid of wanting Tate. Fear meeting fear, devotion answering devotion, neither one winning. They still didn't know how to stop hurting each other, she thought. Susie backed away slowly and closed the door without a sound. In the kitchen, she poured coffee into a mug she'd used 100 times before and stared at the donuts, suddenly too sweet for the morning. When they woke up, she knew one of them would pretend nothing had happened, and the other one would carry it all day like a bruise. Susie pressed her palm to her chest, feeling that familiar ache of loving people who didn't know how to save each other. You're both all in, she thought, that's the tragedy. She turned away at last because watching any longer felt like trespassing on something sacred and doomed. In the kitchen, the donuts sat untouched, sugar clumping as if even sweetness knew it didn't belong here. Susie had known Tate and Noah for 6 years, yet she was no closer to understanding their relationship than she had been the day she first met them. If anything, the passing years had only made it more confusing. Most relationships eventually revealed themselves. Friends either became lovers, drifted apart, or settled comfortably into the familiar rhythm of lifelong companionship. But not Tate and Noah. The longer Susie watched them, the less they seemed to fit into any category she recognized. If there was one thing Susie would swear on her late grandmother's grave, it was this: Tate knew exactly what the bond between him and Noah was. He had to. She would have bet every penny of her inheritance on it. In fact, she would have wagered every dollar she would ever earn for the rest of her life if someone could promise her that Tate would finally tell the truth. Whatever the answer was, Susie wanted it more than almost anything. After years of watching the two of them together, she was convinced there had to be a secret buried somewhere beneath the surface. There simply had to be. No relationship could be this unusual by accident. As far as Susie could see, there were only two possibilities. Either Tate knew something that nobody else knew and was deliberately keeping it to himself. Or he was the blindest, most oblivious, emotionally clueless straight man who had ever lived. Some days she leaned toward the first explanation. Other days she genuinely believed the second. Neither possibility made much sense. What baffled her most was Noah. Noah wasn't just a nice guy. He was one of those rare people who made everyone around him feel comfortable within minutes of meeting him. He was gentle without being weak, endlessly patient, funny in an effortless way, and so genuinely kind that people instinctively trusted him. His smile lit up a room before he even said a word. Then there was his appearance. Noah was undeniably attractive. People noticed him everywhere they went. Men flirted with him, women flirted with him, complete strangers found excuses to start conversations with him. By the time they were living in Los Angeles, Noah had become remarkably popular without ever seeking attention. He attracted people simply by being himself. And yet Noah always drifted back to Tate. Always. Susie couldn't understand why. Nor could she understand why Tate seemed completely unaware of the fact that someone else could walk into Noah's life at any moment. If you don't wake up, she had thought more than once while watching them together, you're going to lose him. Not just romantically. Not just emotionally. In every possible way. Someone as wonderful as Noah wasn't going to remain available forever. Eventually, another man would recognize everything that made Noah extraordinary. Someone would appreciate his loyalty, his warmth, his gentleness, and his endless capacity to love. If that happened before Tate figured himself out, Susie honestly didn't know what Tate would do. She had tried to get answers from him for years. Back when all three of them attended Brown University, she asked him more than once. Sometimes they were walking across campus between classes, sometimes they were eating lunch together, other times they were studying late into the evening when Noah happened to be somewhere else. Tate, she asked one afternoon, why are you so devoted to Noah? He barely looked up. What do you mean? I mean exactly what I said. We're buddies. Susie rolled her eyes. Buddies don't look at each other the way you look at Noah. Tate frowned. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. No, I don't. She leaned forward. You practically worship him. That finally caught his attention. I do not worship Noah. Then explain why you rearrange your entire life around him. I don't. You absolutely do. There isn't anything to explain. That answer irritated Susie every single time. There isn't anything to explain. It was always some version of the same response. Nothing to tell. Nothing unusual. Nothing special. Nothing that required an explanation. She never believed a word of it. Not after everything she had witnessed. Tate's entire personality contradicted the way he behaved around Noah. With almost everyone else, Tate was emotionally reserved to the point of seeming cold. He rarely smiled. He almost never talked about his feelings. He approached problems logically, disliked unnecessary displays of affection, and usually kept people at arm's length. If someone described Tate in one sentence, the words detached, composed, and emotionally unreadable would probably appear somewhere in that description. Then Noah entered the room. Without realizing it, Tate's attention immediately shifted toward him. His eyes found Noah first. He noticed when Noah was tired. He noticed when Noah was upset. He noticed when Noah hadn't eaten. He noticed when Noah smiled. He noticed everything. Tate anticipated Noah's needs before Noah ever voiced them. He quietly changed his own plans whenever Noah needed him. He defended Noah with an intensity that bordered on fierce, yet somehow insisted there was nothing remarkable about any of it. To Susie, it was absurd. It was like watching someone insist they weren't standing in the rain while they were completely soaked. No amount of questioning ever changed Tate's answers. There isn't a secret. There's nothing to explain. You're reading too much into it. Susie never accepted those answers. Not once. She remained convinced that one of two things had to be true. Either Tate understood exactly what bound him to Noah and was protecting that truth with everything he had. Or he genuinely couldn't see what the rest of the world saw every time the two of them stood next to each other. Susie still couldn't decide which explanation was harder to believe. But she was absolutely certain of one thing. The greatest mystery in her life wasn't who Tate and Noah were. It was how Tate could look at Noah every single day and honestly claim there was nothing to explain. She had asked Noah countless questions over the years. Sometimes she was direct. Other times she tried to ease into the conversation, hoping he might accidentally reveal the missing piece that would finally make everything click. Noah never refused to answer. He was always patient, always honest as far as she could tell. But every answer only led to another question. Nothing he said ever explained the invisible thread that held him and Tate together. Susie had even tried asking the same questions in different ways months or years apart, wondering if Noah's explanation might change with time. It never did. Noah would smile apologetically, search for the right words, and explain it as best he could, but somehow his explanations always stopped just short of answering what she really wanted to know. It was as though even Noah himself couldn't fully describe what existed between them. What baffled her most was Tate. For reasons no one could explain, Tate simply would not let Noah go. It wasn't possessiveness in the romantic sense, yet it was stronger than ordinary friendship. It wasn't dependency either, because Tate was fiercely independent in almost every other area of his life. Yet whenever Noah seemed ready to move in another direction, Tate was somehow there, pulling him back, not with threats or manipulation, but with a bond that neither of them seemed capable of breaking. And Noah wasn't trapped. That was the part Susie could never reconcile. If Noah had wanted to leave, surely he could have. He was intelligent, independent, and more than capable of building a life without Tate. Yet every time life offered him an opportunity to put distance between them, he found himself returning. It wasn't out of fear, it wasn't out of obligation. It wasn't because he had nowhere else to go. Somehow, despite everything, Noah always chose to remain in Tate's orbit. They weren't lovers, Susie had become certain of that years ago. They weren't friends either. Friends didn't look at one another the way Tate and Noah sometimes did. Friends didn't instinctively reach for each other without thinking. Friends didn't seem so completely woven into each other's daily existence that separating them felt almost unnatural. They weren't platonic best friends. Even that description felt too simple, too ordinary, too neat for whatever this was. Every label Susie tried eventually fell apart. It wasn't romance. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't family. It wasn't codependency. It wasn't brotherhood. It wasn't anything she had ever seen before. Even their closest friends eventually stopped trying to define it. Every person who spent enough time around Tate and Noah reached the same frustrating conclusion. They could describe what the two men did. They could describe how they behaved around each other. They could even describe the extraordinary loyalty they shared. But no one, not Susie, not their friends, and perhaps not even Tate or Noah themselves, could explain why their connection existed or what to call it. It was as though the two of them had quietly created their own kind of relationship, one that ignored every definition everyone else depended upon. After 6 years of searching for an answer, Susie finally began to suspect there wasn't one. There was simply Tate and Noah, a bond that existed entirely on its own terms, understood only by the two men who lived it. There was only one time Susie thought she might finally get an answer. It happened during their years at Brown University. The three of them had been talking after class and Noah had stepped away for a few minutes. The opportunity was too good to waste. She looked directly at Tate. "So," she asked, "what kind of relationship do you and Noah actually have?" For the first time since she'd started asking him questions about Noah, Tate didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply looked at her. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth curled into a small, knowing smirk. It wasn't an amused smile. It wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't even dismissive. It was something else entirely. It was the expression of someone who had just been reminded of a private joke that no one else in the world understood. For a brief second, Tate looked almost entertained. His eyes softened ever so slightly, and there was a quiet satisfaction behind that tiny smile, as though Susie's question itself was amusing for reasons only he could appreciate. The expression lasted only a moment before his face settled back into its usual calm, unreadable mask. Susie stared at him. "What?" she asked. Tate simply shook his head. "Nothing." "No, seriously, what was that look?" "What look?" "The one you just had." "I didn't have a look." "You absolutely did." Tate's smile disappeared completely. "There's nothing to tell." Susie wasn't buying it. "There has to be." "There isn't." "Then why did you smile like that?" "I don't know what you're talking about." She continued watching him, hoping he would accidentally say something. Anything. Instead, he merely shrugged, stood up, and changed the subject as though the conversation had never happened. It drove Susie crazy. That single expression haunted her for years. It wasn't the smile itself that bothered her, it was what the smile implied. For one fleeting moment, Tate had looked like a man who knew an answer no one else knew. Not a romantic smile. Not an embarrassed smile. A knowing one. As if Susie's question had touched upon something so obvious to him that explaining it seemed unnecessary, or perhaps impossible. It was the only time she had ever seen Tate react that way when anyone asked about Noah. Years later, Susie still remembered that tiny smirk more vividly than any of his actual answers. Because every answer Tate ever gave was the same. There's nothing to tell. But that smile told Susie there was a story. Whether Tate realized it or not, for one brief second, his face had betrayed him. It was the face of a man who either knew exactly what his bond with Noah was, or who carried a truth so deeply inside himself that he couldn't even put it into words. If anyone had ever asked Susie what Tate was like, she wouldn't have needed time to think. He's emotionless, she'd say, cold-hearted, supercilious, abrupt, sometimes outright cruel, and more often than he'd ever admit, he has a habit of dehumanizing people. That was the Tate most of the world knew. He kept everyone at arm's length. Conversations with him were usually short, blunt, and painfully direct. He rarely smiled, almost never spoke about his feelings, and seemed to view emotions as inconveniences rather than something worth expressing. He had little patience for sentimentality and even less patience for people he considered irrational. If someone disappointed him, he dismissed them without a second thought. To many people, Tate came across as intimidating. To others, he seemed emotionally unreachable. Some even wondered whether he genuinely cared about anyone besides himself. Susie understood why they thought that. If she had only known Tate without Noah, she probably would have described him exactly the same way. Then Noah entered the picture. The change was impossible to miss. The moment Noah was nearby, Tate became a completely different person. It wasn't dramatic enough for strangers to notice. He didn't suddenly become outgoing or overly affectionate, but for those who knew him well, the difference was unmistakable. His voice softened. His expression relaxed. The perpetual tension in his face disappeared. He smiled more often than he ever did around anyone else. He became patient. He listened. He paid attention. Most astonishing of all, he became gentle. It was as though Noah reached a part of Tate that no one else even knew existed. Tate noticed everything about him. If Noah was tired, Tate noticed. If Noah skipped a meal, Tate noticed. If Noah seemed anxious, distracted, or unusually quiet, Tate noticed long before anyone else did. He rarely missed anything when it came to Noah. The contrast was so extreme that Susie sometimes wondered whether she was looking at the same man. Around everyone else, Tate seemed emotionally frozen. Around Noah, he became unmistakably human. It wasn't that Noah changed Tate into someone new. It was Noah who revealed the person Tate hid from everyone else. That was why Susie never believed Tate whenever he claimed there was nothing to explain. There was clearly something to explain. She had spent years watching Noah accomplish what no one else could. He could calm Tate without trying. He could make Tate laugh. He could pull warmth from a man who otherwise seemed made of ice. Without Noah nearby, Tate moved through life almost mechanically. He still went to work. He still carried on conversations, he still accomplished everything expected of him, but there was an emptiness to him as though he were simply existing instead of truly living. To Susie, he looked like a zombie, walking, talking, functioning, but somehow hollow inside. Then Noah would walk into the room. Almost instantly, the emptiness disappeared. Life returned to Tate's eyes. His attention shifted instinctively toward Noah as naturally as breathing. The hard edges of his personality softened and the emotional distance he kept from the rest of the world quietly melted away. That was the moment Susie finally understood something she couldn't quite put into words. Whatever Noah was to Tate, he wasn't merely his closest companion. He wasn't merely his favorite person. Noah was the center of Tate's emotional world. He was the one person who could awaken the humanity Tate seemed to keep hidden from everyone else. In Susie's mind, there was only one way to describe it. Noah wasn't just part of Tate's life. Noah was Tate's heart. And without that heart nearby, Tate seemed to wander through the world like a man who was alive only in the most technical sense of the word. If anyone had asked Susie what Noah meant to Tate, she wouldn't have hesitated for even a second. I think Noah is the only part of Tate's heart that exists. It wasn't meant as an insult. It was simply the only explanation that fit. Tate could be cold, detached, dismissive, and emotionally impenetrable with almost everyone he met. He rarely let people close enough to matter, and when they disappointed him, he could cut them out of his life with startling ease. But Noah was different. Noah was the one exception to every rule Tate lived by. The one person who could reach him. The one person who could soften him. The one person whose happiness genuinely seemed to matter more to Tate than his own comfort. Sometimes Susie wondered whether Tate even realized how obvious it was. If Noah laughed, Tate's expression softened. If Noah was hurt, Tate noticed immediately. If Noah needed him, Tate was already moving before anyone else had recognized there was a problem. It was as though every emotion Tate had ever been capable of feeling had been gathered together and entrusted to one person. Noah. That was why Susie often found herself thinking the same thing. Noah wasn't just someone Tate loved in whatever way Tate was capable of loving. He was the only visible piece of Tate's heart. Everything else about Tate seemed protected behind walls of logic, restraint, and emotional distance. But somehow Noah had slipped past every one of those defenses years ago and made a permanent home there. As far as Susie could tell, if there was any part of Tate capable of unconditional tenderness, compassion, or vulnerability, Noah was the only person who had ever seen it. And perhaps the only person who ever would. Tate was not a physically affectionate person. He didn't hug people. He didn't kiss anyone. He didn't casually touch, hold, or comfort others through physical affection. He wasn't the kind of person who reached out for someone just because he cared about them. For most people, physical closeness seemed almost foreign to him, something he tolerated rather than sought. But Noah was the exception. For reasons Susie could never fully understand, Tate could not seem to keep his distance from Noah. It was never calculated or performed for anyone else. It was simply something that happened naturally, almost unconsciously. Tate always seemed to find some small reason to be near him, to touch his shoulder, lean against him, sit close beside him, or make some quiet gesture of reassurance that he would never offer anyone else. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The same man who kept the rest of the world at arm's length seemed to forget every boundary he had ever created when it came to Noah. Susie noticed it immediately, especially because it was so unlike Tate. This was a man who prided himself on control, a man who carefully measured his words, guarded his emotions, and rarely allowed anyone to see vulnerability. Yet around Noah, that control disappeared. There seemed to be no distance between them. No invisible wall. No hesitation. No need to pretend they weren't important to each other. Even as they grew older and entered their 20s, that closeness never faded. If anything, it became more obvious. The way Tate treated Noah didn't match the way he treated anyone else, and Susie couldn't understand how Tate could fail to recognize the difference. To everyone watching from the outside, the message was clear. Whatever Tate and Noah were to each other, it was something rare. Something that existed outside the rules Tate seemed to follow with everyone else. Because when it came to Noah, Tate didn't act like the cold, distant person everyone knew. He acted like someone who had finally found the one person he could let close. To Susie, none of it felt normal. Not because there was anything wrong with affection between two people, but because Tate himself was the person who made the situation impossible to understand. By the time they were 24 years old, Tate and Noah had a level of physical closeness that seemed completely at odds with everything Tate claimed to believe. They shared a mattress without hesitation. They could fall asleep beside each other, lean against one another for hours, or end up physically close while watching movies or talking late into the night. They touched casually and naturally, as though the concept of personal space disappeared whenever it involved Noah. And yet they continued to insist they were just buddies. Susie had never been able to understand that explanation. What made it even more confusing was Tate himself. Tate was openly uncomfortable with homosexuality. He had expressed extremely disdainful homophobic opinions that Susie found outdated and harsh. At times, he could be dismissive and judgmental toward people who challenged his worldview. He was the last person anyone would expect to ignore traditional boundaries around male friendship. That was why his relationship with Noah was such a contradiction. How could Tate, someone who seemed so determined to separate himself from anything he associated with being gay, be the same person who constantly crossed the physical boundaries most men placed between themselves and another man? How could someone so rigid about his beliefs be so completely relaxed when it came to Noah? Tate held Noah's hand. Tate sought out Noah's physical closeness. Tate allowed a level of comfort and affection with Noah that he would never permit with anyone else. The contradiction was impossible for Susie to ignore. She wondered if Tate even understood how unusual it looked from the outside. The rest of the world saw the difference immediately. They saw that Noah was the one exception to every rule Tate had created for himself. The man who was cold with everyone else became gentle with Noah. The man who avoided vulnerability with everyone else allowed Noah closer than anyone. The man who seemed determined to control every aspect of his image completely abandoned that control whenever Noah was involved. Susie couldn't explain it. Maybe Tate truly did not understand what his behavior meant. Maybe he had convinced himself that because he had a certain idea of himself, his actions couldn't possibly contradict it. Or maybe there was something about Noah that mattered more to Tate than any belief, expectation, or boundary he had ever created. Whatever the reason, Susie knew one thing. Tate had built walls around himself that nobody was allowed to cross. Except Noah. And somehow Noah had walked through every single one. Love was love. Some love wasn't about who gave more. Some love was about two people giving everything and still coming up empty. A tear slipped down before Susie realized she was crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet betrayal of how deeply it had gotten under her skin. The way they fit together like this, careless and careful all at once, was devastatingly beautiful. It felt old, earned, like something the world had tried very hard to undo and failed. And then her eyes remembered their bed. That startled her, not because it was messy or small or intimate, but because it was ordinary. A plain wooden frame, worn sheets, one pillow flatter than it should have been, the kind of bed you keep because it's comfortable, not because it impresses anyone. Tate could have had anything. His family could buy a mansion without checking the price. 50 rooms, guest wings, beds no one ever slept in, space so large it echoed. And yet here they were curled together in a cramped bedroom in a 1,200 square foot green rambler in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing important was supposed to happen. Susie swallowed. He chose this, not the wealth, not the distance, not the insulation of luxury. He chose shared walls, creaky floors, and a place where you couldn't escape the people you loved even if you tried. There were 2 bedrooms, she knew that. She'd helped them move in, but standing here now she couldn't remember where the other one was. It felt irrelevant somehow. It existed only on paper. Like this room, this bed was the truth of the place and everything else was just a technicality. Tate shifted in his sleep, pressing closer as if the house itself wasn't enough to keep Noah from slipping away. Noah breathed out slowly, accepting the weight, the warmth, the history. Susie wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. It hit her then, this wasn't nostalgia or habit or weakness. This was a choice. Every night Tate stayed here instead of somewhere bigger, quieter, or safer. Every night Noah stayed instead of leaving when it would have hurt less. They were choosing the smallest space because it was the only one that could hold what they had. Susie backed away, heart aching, suddenly aware that some people don't need room to prove devotion. They just need someone willing to stay close enough to be hurt. That night it happened without discussion, without hesitation, like their bodies remembered something their words still refused to touch. They ended up in the same bed the way they used to when they were kids. No decision. No, are you sure? Tate came up behind Noah automatically, fitting there like it was the only shape he knew. His arm settled around Noah's waist, not possessive, not demanding, just there, familiar, protective in a way that didn't ask for anything back. It felt natural. That was the part that hurt. Noah lay still at first, waiting for the moment when something would change, when Tate's breathing would hitch, when his hand would wander, when the closeness would turn into expectation. It never did. Tate stayed exactly where he was, forehead near the back of Noah's neck, breathing warm and steady like a promise he didn't know how to make while awake. Nothing happened, and somehow that mattered more than if it had. Noah's body slowly relaxed, the tension he'd carried for months easing inch by inch. This wasn't desire or confusion or hope. It was rest. It was being held without being asked to become anything else. For the first time in a long while, Noah didn't brace himself for loss. Tate shifted once in his sleep, pulling Noah closer with a quiet sound, like even unconscious he was afraid of distance. Noah didn't wake. He didn't pull away. He slept straight through the night, deep and undisturbed, wrapped in something that felt painfully like home. By morning, nothing would have changed. No confessions, no clarity, no resolution, just the quiet devastation of how right it still felt and how careful they'd been not to cross a line neither of them knew how to survive. Susie moved quietly down the hall, her footsteps soft against the floor as if she didn't want the apartment to know she was there. She opened the first door she came to and found the bathroom. It was simple, clean lines, pale tiles, but warm in a way that felt intentional. Old-fashioned paintings hung crookedly on the walls, and the shower curtain was patterned with faded tapestries, the kind you only find if someone went looking for them. It didn't feel like Tate's taste alone. It felt shared. Curated without being discussed. She washed her hands carefully, letting the water run a little longer than necessary, grounding herself in the ordinary act of it. Clean hands for donuts. Clean hands for a morning that was already complicated. She shut the door, flicked off the light, and stood in the dark hallway for a moment before turning back toward the bedroom where the boys slept. 2 doors down on the left, she hesitated, then opened it. The room was colder somehow. It wasn't really a bedroom, more like a place someone had stopped believing in. There was a bed, nice actually, a good mattress, not cheap, but it looked untouched, the sheets too neatly pulled back, dust settled thinly along the headboard and nightstand. No phone charger, no books, no clothes tossed over a chair, unused, or used only when things went wrong. Susie's chest tightened as understanding crept in. This wasn't a guest room. This was where Tate went when Noah was angry, when words had cut too close, when staying felt like pushing instead of loving. The bed didn't look cozy, it didn't look lived in, it looked like exile. A few months, maybe more, since anyone had slept here regularly, just long enough for dust to gather, just long enough for absence to leave a mark. "So that's how you do it," she whispered. "You punish yourselves with space." She closed the door gently, like the room might be ashamed of itself, and leaned her forehead against the wall for a moment. The contrast hit her hard, the empty bed, untouched, versus the other one, warm and crowded and chosen. 2 bedrooms, 2 options, and every time it mattered, they chose the same one. Susie straightened, wiped at her eyes, and headed back toward the kitchen, donuts in hand, carrying the weight of what she'd learned, that even when they fought, even when they tried to be careful, they never really stopped belonging to each other. Susie took it in properly now, the way you do when a place starts telling you the truth without meaning to. The apartment wasn't one person's vision. It had never been. It was a careful, uneven blend, 2 lives layered over each other until you couldn't quite tell where one ended and the other began. She could see Noah everywhere. Simple, sturdy furniture, pieces chosen because they would last, not because they impressed. Books were stacked where they were used. Little knickknacks tucked onto shelves, souvenirs that only made sense if you knew the story behind them. The apartment felt lived in because Noah lived fully, leaving evidence behind without trying. And then there was Tate, quieter but still present. Muted sandy tones, clean lines, modern finishes that looked intentional, professional, and restrained. A lamp here, a chair there, tasteful, controlled, like someone who knew how to curate a space but didn't quite know how to inhabit it. More than half of it leaned toward Noah, not because Tate didn't care, but because he always made room. Susie glanced again at the unused room. Now it made even more sense. This wasn't really a bedroom. It had become a storage space by accident, slowly, the way emotional distance creeps in when no one names it. Boxes of supplies. Hobby gear was stacked neatly along one wall, practical things, distractions, anything that kept the room from becoming something personal. It was the physical manifestation of Tate stepping back. A room that existed on paper but not in practice. A place for overflow, for not sleeping, for proving that he had his own space even while never using it. Susie's throat tightened. The contrast was brutal, the shared spaces full of Noah's life, the private space Tate was supposed to claim left untouched. It told a story she wasn't sure either of them realized they were telling, that this apartment had been arranged around not resentment, not sacrifice, love expressed as absence. She rested her hand on the doorframe for a moment, steadying herself. Some people love taking up space, others love by shrinking theirs. Tate didn't shrink but molded himself around Noah's living spaces. She'd known it for years, hell, Noah had told her. Late one night at Brown, sitting on the cold steps outside the library, voice low like saying it too loudly might make it real. He hadn't dressed it up or made excuses, he just said Tate's name and then gone quiet like that explained everything, and it had. Noah loved Tate in a way that didn't ask to be chosen, in a way that settled deep and stayed. It wasn't dramatic or needy, it was patient, enduring, devastatingly sincere. The kind of love that rearranges your life without announcing itself. Tate, meanwhile, had his head firmly lodged in his own denial, treating Noah like just a companion, as if history erased gravity, like sleeping behind Noah, holding his hand, choosing him every night somehow didn't mean anything beyond habit. Tate acted as if love only counted when it followed rules he felt safe with. Susie felt anger rise, sharp and protective. How could he not see it? Noah didn't demand, didn't push, didn't corner Tate with ultimatums. He loved him quietly, responsibly, like he was afraid that wanting too much would make Tate disappear altogether. And Tate, brilliant, privileged, emotionally stunted Tate, took that restraint as permission. He thinks platonic closeness is the safest lie, Susie realized bitterly. Susie didn't know if Tate calling Noah a buddy meant Tate kept him close without risking himself, let him touch without nomming, depend without committing, hurt Noah without ever having to admit he was doing it. Susie glanced back toward the bedroom door, jaw tight. Noah would never say it again. Not after Brown, not after the look on Tate's face when he'd laughed it off, brushed it aside, not understanding what was being offered. Noah had learned then to fold his love smaller, quieter, survivable. And Tate was either still pretending he hadn't been handed the one thing he was most afraid to want, or was he really straight? Susie exhaled slowly, sadness outweighing the anger now. You idiot, she thought not unkindly. You're an idiot, Tate, if you're not in love with Noah. And until Tate pulled his head out of his own fear, Noah would keep paying the price, loving him faithfully, invisibly as just a friend while sharing a bed that told the truth. Tate wouldn't. Susie knew the answer already, even before she remembered the conversation. She'd asked Tate once, plainly, directly, if he liked Noah. There had been no hesitation, no crack in his certainty. Yes, he'd said, as a childhood buddy. Nothing defensive about the word itself. What came after was what stuck with her. The way he shut the door so hard it echoed, the way he insisted on boundaries that didn't actually exist in practice, the way he followed that insistence with disgust, not fear, not confusion, but rejection of the idea. Tate wasn't suppressing love how most people understood it. He simply didn't feel it that way. That was the hardest truth to sit with. Tate loved Noah deeply, but the love was platonic, familiar, and ingrained, unquestioned. The kind that grows from shared childhood, shared survival, shared memory. Noah was home to him, stability, loyalty, a constant. Tate didn't romanticize that bond because he didn't need to. It existed without great effort, and that was exactly why he treated Noah as just a buddy, not out of denial, out of certainty. Susie could see it now, standing in their home that quietly testified to how much Tate valued comfort over intimacy. He slept behind Noah because it was what he'd always done, because it felt right in the way habits do, because Noah made the world quieter, but love, romantic love, was something else entirely. Tate didn't ache for Noah, he didn't yearn, he didn't imagine a domestic future reframed by him. He didn't allow himself to want Noah because wanting implied something he simply didn't feel, and that didn't make him cruel, but it made the situation devastating, because Noah loved him. Susie had known Tate since Brown. Noah hadn't said it like a confession, he'd said it like a fact he carried carefully, aware of its weight. He loved Tate not because of habit but because of choice, because of longing, because of hope. He kept painfully quiet. Tate's mistake wasn't hatred or fear, it was comfort. He let Noah love him without meaning to return it, or was unaware Noah loved him at all. He accepted devotion in a relationship because it suited him, because it cost him nothing to stay where he was. Susie's chest ached at the imbalance. Two people could share a bed, a home, a history, and still be standing on opposite sides of the same truth. Tate gave Noah grace, stability, and presence. Noah gave Tate his heart, and Tate gave it back platonically. Tate was so blind, he actually believed they were close because he didn't feel anything like passion for Noah. And Tate never asked for it because the guy didn't know he needed to. That was the tragedy, not repression, not denial. Just one soul loving forward and the other loving sideways, never cruel enough to push away, never brave enough to step back. And Susie knew with a quiet, sick certainty that the longer Tate stayed comfortable, the longer Noah would stay broken in silence. Susie noticed Tate's keys by accident. They were sitting on the counter by the sink, tossed there carelessly the way Tate always did, metal catching the morning light, familiar keyring, familiar weight. She picked them up without thinking, the habit automatic, and stepped back out onto the porch to grab the mail. She pulled the door closed behind her and locked it from the inside, routine, practiced, almost domestic. Then idly she turned the keys in her hand. That's when she saw it, a small cyan-colored key, smaller than the rest, old-looking, plain, not decorative, not modern, almost out of place against the newer apartment keys and car fob. She frowned, turning it over between her fingers. The key must be 10 years old or more, probably an heirloom, but it didn't look that old. There was a blue number printed on the front that was the letter 3. She didn't recognize the key. Susie tried using the key on the sheds first. No fit. Tried the porch storage lock. Nothing. When she stepped back inside, she tested it quietly on the storage room door, then the bathroom. Nowhere. It didn't belong to this house. A strange unease settled in her chest. Tate wasn't careless about things like this. He didn't keep useless objects. He didn't carry extras. Everything he owned had a purpose, even if that purpose was small or private. She stood there in the quiet kitchen, mail tucked under her arm, staring at the key like it might explain itself if she waited long enough. What doesn't Noah know? She wondered. She had believed since Brown that Tate had no secrets from Noah because Tate hated it when Noah had secrets. She couldn't think what it belonged with. Tate hated family sentiment, so holding onto an old, worn key wasn't like him. The key wasn't practical. Something different or distant. Something that didn't belong to them. Susie was shocked that the boy so dedicated to Noah had secrets. Susie slid the key back onto the ring carefully, exactly where it had been, like she was afraid of being caught. Knowing too much. The apartment felt different now, still warm, still balanced in blue and green, but no longer whole. Everyone had a place they didn't bring home, and suddenly she wondered if that small, unfamiliar cyan-colored key was the clearest proof yet that Tate's life, no matter how intertwined with Noah's, still had doors that stayed firmly locked. Susie turned the key over in her palm again. It was small, smaller than the others. The metal was worn smooth at the edges, the cyan enamel chipped and dulled with age, not trendy, old-fashioned, or decorative, functional, almost institutional. Old, it was the kind of key you keep because you've always kept it, not because you remember what it opens. What did the number 3 mean? Why did Tate carry it with him everywhere? It didn't belong to anything here. That unsettled her more than if it had. Tate was like that, mysterious in ways that didn't announce themselves. He didn't brood, he didn't dramatize his depth. He simply carried parts of himself quietly, sealed off, practical about it, complicated without being messy, private without being deceptive. People assumed things about him because of his family, his money, and his looks. They thought access explained him. It didn't. Susie slipped the key back onto the ring, careful to place it exactly where it had been, like returning a thought to someone else's mind. Noah woke 15 minutes later, padding into his kitchen, relieved that Susie had made coffee. Once Noah made himself available over coffee in the living room, Susie asked Noah about the key and if he knew about any of Tate's secrets. Noah, Susie asked, do you know what the cyan-colored key on the table is for? I expect it's Tate's. Haven't a clue, Noah shrugged. Okay, she sighed, defeated. They stood there a moment longer, sharing that quiet understanding, the way humor could be kindness and avoidance at the same time. From the living room, the paper rustled again, and somewhere between the joke and the apology, between laughter and silence, the real question remained untouched, still waiting for a day neither of them was ready to face. Noah's voice dropped, steady but tight, like he was bracing himself. Tate doesn't want me to have friends like Mark, he said. He called him a pervert, said he was trying to corrupt a straight guy, me. Susie's jaw clenched. Jesus. He said it like it was obvious, I went on, like Mark's existence was an agenda, like the closeness was the crime. He let out a breath that sounded more tired than angry, but what really bothered him wasn't Mark's sexuality, it was the ease. The ease, Susie echoed. Yeah, I said, with Mark the emotional intimacy just happened, we talked, we were honest, there wasn't all this careful choreography. His mouth twitched, humorless. I didn't have to disappear in the morning. Susie felt the comparison land hard between them. And with Tate, she said quietly. I hesitated. With Tate, everything had rules, unspoken ones. We weren't even sleeping in the same bed for 6 months, not because we didn't care, because caring required pretending certain things didn't exist. Susie shook her head. So Tate sees you being close with Mark, and instead of asking what that closeness gives you. He calls it corruption, Noah finished. Because if it's corruption, he doesn't have to admit it's something he refuses to offer. Tate sees all gays or queers as predators and male-on-male love or sex as unnatural or perverted. The room felt heavy with it, the irony, the loss. Tate isn't jealous of Mark wanting you, Susie said. He's jealous that Mark can meet you emotionally without making you smaller. Noah nodded once. It was effortless with Mark. With Tate, it's always negotiated. From the living room, the newspaper shifted, mundane, distant. And that's why he couldn't stand Mark, Susie added. Not because Mark crossed a line Mark wanted to cross that line, but because he showed you how little strain intimacy could take. I leaned back against the wall, eyes closed for a second. Yeah. He opened them again, quieter, and once I knew that, it got harder to keep pretending months apart in the same house was normal. Susie reached for his hand. He took it, not dramatic, not loud, just honest. Finally, with someone who wouldn't call it corruption. Susie hesitated, then asked it plainly. No, softness, no judgment. Did you ever sleep with Mark? Noah froze for a second, then he exhaled, slow, like he'd expected the question eventually. Yes, he said quietly, no detail, no bravado, just truth. Once the night Tate slept with Tina at Brown. Susie's eyebrows lifted, not in shock, more in recognition. And it wasn't dramatic, Noah added. It wasn't some big forbidden thing. He shrugged slightly. It was easy, we cared about each other. That, more than the answer itself, seemed to land hardest. Susie nodded slowly. That's what Tate sensed, isn't it? Noah didn't argue. Yeah, not the act, the closeness. He looked down at his hands. With Mark, nothing had to be hidden or negotiated, no pretending, no rules about daylight, a beat. It didn't replace Tate, but it showed me how uncomplicated it could be. Susie sighed, rubbing her forehead, and Tate called that corruption. Tate doesn't know that Mark and I fucked, just suspects Mark wants to get in my pants, because if it were just sex, Noah said softly, it wouldn't threaten him this much. They stood there in the quiet, the weight of it settling. Susie looked at Noah with something fierce and protective in her eyes. You weren't wrong, she said, for any of it. I swallowed. I know, I just wish knowing that didn't make loving Tate feel so lonely. I didn't answer right away. I think, Noah said slowly, he suspects I'm gay. Susie watched his face. I disagree. The last time Tate and I spoke of you concerning homosexuality, he ardently said you were straight. Probably, I said, if he knew it wouldn't be this quiet. I rubbed his thumb against his knuckle, a tell she recognized immediately. Tate doesn't ask questions he's afraid of the answers to, he circles them, he watches, he makes comments that are just sharp enough to test the ground. Like calling Mark a pervert, Susie said. Exactly, Noah replied. That wasn't random, that was him saying I see something and I don't like it without having to say what it actually was. Susie frowned, so he sensed the intimacy. Yes, Noah said, the way Mark and I talked, the ease, the fact that I didn't look guarded around him. He swallowed. Tate notices when I'm different with someone. But he never asked you outright. No, Noah said quietly, because if he asked and I told the truth he'd have to do something with it. And that scares him, Susie said. Noah nodded, more than being wrong, more than being angry. A pause. Tate can live with suspicion, he can't live with confirmation. Susie folded her arms, jaw tight, so instead he punishes the situation. He controls it, Noah said, decides who I can be close to, decides what kind of intimacy is acceptable. His voice dropped. Susie shook her head, anger flashing. That's so Tate, that's avoidance with teeth. I gave a faint, tired smile. Yeah, some of Tate's dreams are quite vivid. He has bad dreams sometimes when he's stressed or we're fighting. He looked toward the living room without meaning to, like part of him was always tracking Tate's presence. If Tate ever actually knew I was gay, he added softly, he wouldn't joke, he wouldn't deflect. What would he do? Susie asked. Noah didn't answer immediately. I don't know, he said finally, and I hope I never have to find out that's the problem. Because suspicion had already changed Tate's behavior. And certainty, Susie knew, wouldn't make him gentler, it would just make everything impossible to keep pretending was accidental. Susie stopped him gently, needing to be absolutely clear. Noah said I told him I was straight. The words sat there clean, simple, devastating. Susie let out a slow breath. You told him that? Yes, Noah's mouth tightened just a little. Early on, when it first started to matter, I made sure of it. So everything Tate thinks he's protecting, she said carefully, is based on that. I nodded. He believes it completely. That's why he feels justified in saying the things he says. Why does he frame Mark as a threat instead of an option? A pause. In his head, I'm a straight guy being influenced, not someone being honest. Susie's heart sank. So he's not reacting to you being gay. No, Noah said softly, he's reacting to the idea that someone might make me less his. That landed hard. Susie rubbed her arms, unsettled. That's worse, she murmured. I didn't disagree. If he thought I was gay, he'd have to rewrite everything. Our history, the bed we share, the way he touches me in his sleep. He looked down. This way he doesn't have to question himself at all. So you carry it, Susie said, all of it. Yes. She looked at him, eyes shining not with pity but with anger on his behalf. You shouldn't have had to lie just to stay safe. Noah gave a small, tired smile. I know, but telling him I was straight was the only way to keep the ground from shifting. Susie swallowed, because now she understood something chilling. Tate's homophobia wasn't just abstract, it was insulated by Noah's silence. Noah was just as guilty as Tate for both men thinking incorrect lies about the other. And if that silence ever broke, Tate wouldn't just be learning something new about Noah, he'd be realizing how much of his certainty had been built on a lie he never questioned because it benefited him. Susie reached out and squeezed Noah's hand. You don't owe him that lie forever. I squeezed back just as gently. I know. But the way he glanced toward the living room said he also knew how dangerous the truth could be. And for now, survival still meant being believed as someone he wasn't. Noah said it quietly, without drama, like he was stating a law of physics. If I have to keep this lie together just to stay close with Tate, just to have him share my bed, I'd do it for 50 more years. Easy. If I have to choose between Tate's love, respect, body, or transparency, I choose his body and presence every damn time. Susie stared at him, not because she didn't understand, but because she did. That's not nothing, she said softly. I gave a small shrug. It's not heroic either, it's just the cost of keeping him. Keeping this, he didn't say, the mornings, the shared space. The way Tate reached for him in his sleep was like it was instinct, not choice. You shouldn't have to trade your truth for closeness, Susie said, even as her voice betrayed how much she knew he already had. I know, I replied, but closeness with Tate has always come with expectations he thinks are normal, and I've lied to him, which makes him believe white lies. They're just unspoken usually. A pause. Lying is easier than losing him. Susie felt something crack in her chest. You realize, she said carefully, that he gets everything his way, your presence, your loyalty, your body beside him at night. And I get him, I said, that's the deal. She shook her head, eyes burning. You're not afraid of being alone, she said. You're afraid of waking up without him ever again. I didn't deny it. He doesn't know what he's asking you, Susie said, half pleading. No, I agreed, but he benefits from it. His voice softened, and I think he'd choose differently if he did know. That was the quietest tragedy of all. Susie reached out, gripping his hands now, not gentle anymore. Loving someone shouldn't require erasing parts of yourself. I smiled at her then, real, fond, devastating. I'm not erased, he said, I'm just adapting. Paused for decades, paused for safety, paused for a man who slept better believing a lie that let him keep everything exactly as it was. From the living room, the newspaper was folded, footsteps shifted, Tate moved, alive, present, oblivious. I let go of Susie's hands, already rearranging himself back into the version that fit. I'd do it again, he said quietly, every morning, every time. Susie watched him turn toward the hallway, heart aching, because love like that wasn't a weakness, it was endurance, and she wasn't sure whether that made it more beautiful or more unforgivable. Susie's voice dropped, careful but direct. Does Tate know you saw him and Emily on your birthday fucking in his room? That's why you moved into the guest room. I went very still. No, he said quietly, he doesn't know I saw them. Susie's brows knit, at all. No, I swallowed, he thinks I just needed space because of his sleep disorder, that I wanted my own room for a while. And you let him believe that? Yes, my jaw tightened like that memory still had teeth. It wasn't just the house, Noah said quietly. It started back at the blue house when I stopped sleeping in his bed there. Susie looked up, he noticed. Immediately, I said. He didn't say why, but he noticed everything. He leaned his shoulder against the wall, eyes distant. He'd find excuses to knock on my door late or break through the door, ask if I was sick, ask if I couldn't sleep. He'd stand there too long like he was waiting for an invitation I wasn't offering anymore. Susie's chest ached, then she asked Noah, jealous. Yes, I said, not openly, not in a way he'd ever admit, but he was off balance. A pause. He started snapping at people, at me. He'd make comments, small ones, about how it was weird that I suddenly needed space. And you never told him why, Susie said. No, my voice softened. Because if I told him I'd walked in on him and Emily on my birthday, it would have cracked everything open, and if I told him it hurt, he'd have had to choose what I was allowed to be heard about. Susie swallowed, so instead. Yes, I continued, he watched me pull away and couldn't figure out where I was going. He didn't like not knowing. His mouth twitched, sad. He'd lie awake and reach for me anyway, even when I wasn't there. That landed heavy. He was jealous of the absence, Susie said. Yes, I nodded, jealous of whatever replaced him in that space, even if it was just my own bed. A beat. He didn't want me gone, he just didn't want to ask what staying meant. Susie shook her head, anger and grief tangling. So, he wants you close, but only on terms where he doesn't have to examine. I met her eyes, exactly. From the living room, the faint rustle of movement, Tate shifting, alive, unaware, carried down the hall. I exhaled. When I stopped sleeping in his bed, it scared him, he said softly, not because he lost me, but because he couldn't name what he was losing. Susie reached for his hand, gripping it tight. You shouldn't have to disappear just to keep him calm. I squeezed back. I know. I said it again, more carefully this time, stripping it down to what it felt like, not the language around it. Susie always knew Tate was attractive, unfairly so, the kind of attractiveness that didn't try. Tall, composed, features that looked deliberate even when he was half asleep. He moved through rooms with an ease that made people look twice without meaning to. Noah noticed, every time, not in a shallow way, not like lust flaring and fatting. It was quieter than that, a constant awareness like gravity. Noah's eyes tracked Tate automatically when he laughed, when he leaned against a doorway, when he focused on something and forgot the rest of the world. Noah noticed because he cared, because love sharpens attention. Tate always noticed that he was being noticed by others. That might have been the cruelest imbalance of all. Susie leaned against the counter, the blue and green house humming softly around her. A small, forgotten old key lay nearby, unknown to Noah. A man who kept parts of himself compartmentalized without malice. A boy who loved him without asking to be seen. Tate wasn't one-dimensional, he wasn't easy to read. He was simply more layered than he looked, and Noah was loving him on a level Tate didn't even know existed. Susie exhaled slowly. Some people are mysteries because they're afraid of the truth. Others are mysteries because they've already decided what the truth is and never think to look again. Susie had tried. God, she really had. Over the years, she'd given Tate openings, gentle ones. Late-night conversations, half-joking questions, moments where people usually let something real slip. She'd made herself safe, neutral, steady, the kind of person you tell things to because they won't flinch or gossip or weaponize it later. Tate never took the bait. He was polite, calm, always composed, a closed book in the most frustrating way, not defensive, not hostile, just sealed. Whatever lived behind his eyes stayed there, orderly and untouched. He listened more than he spoke, answered what was asked and nothing beyond it. You could sit next to him for hours and still feel like you'd learned nothing new. That mystery was part of his pull. It made people curious, it made Noah linger. What startled Susie, what still did, was the homophobia, not loud, not cartoonish. Nothing you could point to and say there, that's it. It wasn't subtle, casual, embedded in language, in jokes that weren't jokes, in the way Tate shut things down before they could even be discussed. He wouldn't say the word gay, instead Tate just used the F slur. He had nothing but contempt for queer men. If you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it entirely, And that was the problem. It didn't match the rest of him, the restraint, the intelligence, the way he lived so intentionally. It sat beneath the surface like a hairline fracture, easy to ignore until pressure hit just right. Susie knew now it wasn't ignorance. And it wasn't fear either, it was conviction. Tate's parents were liberals. Never had Noah or Susie heard anything homophobic said by Terrence or Talia. Terrence had mentioned Fire Island once when Noah was much younger, but it was a moral statement, not a contemptuous opinion. Terrence Blue had grown up during a generation where the nuclear family and biblical morals were the social norm. Terrence wasn't homophobic. He just didn't like talking about things he didn't understand. Did Tate learn his homophobia at school or by living next to homophobic peers at school? She didn't know, and Noah hadn't a clue either. She had asked Tate once why he hated queers when his family didn't. He made a weird sound in his throat, then changed the topic. A line he'd drawn early and never revisited. Something absorbed, internalized, rationalized into something that sounded reasonable if you didn't listen too closely. He didn't rant, he didn't posture, he simply excluded certain possibilities from his world and treated that exclusion as common sense, which made it worse. Because people like that don't think they're doing harm. Susie glanced again toward the bedroom where Noah had slept, unaware. Noah, who loved openly and deeply without the armor Tate wore so effortlessly. Noah, who existed on the wrong side of a boundary Tate had decided was immovable. It made Susie's chest ache with a helpless kind of anger. She couldn't make Tate open up. She couldn't make him kinder in the places he'd decided didn't need examination. And she couldn't protect Noah from loving someone who would never fully see him. Tate was calm, mysterious, attractive, controlled, and beneath all of that there were limits, quiet. Rigid limits that shaped everything he touched. He wouldn't talk about certain topics, family, his childhood, or New York where he lived prior to moving to California. Susie leaned back against the counter, exhausted by the knowing of it. Some people aren't loud about what they reject. They just build their lives so carefully that the things they don't accept never get close enough to leave a mark, except on the people who love them anyway. Susie didn't soften it anymore, not even in her own head. Tate hated gay people, not loudly, not theatrically. He didn't march around picking fights or making speeches. He did something colder than that. He erased them. When the subject came up at all, which was rare, he used slurs with an offhand cruelty that made your stomach drop, like he was stating a fact instead of exposing a prejudice. Then he shut the door on the topic entirely, as if acknowledging it for longer than a few seconds would contaminate something. 99% of the time he acted like queerness didn't exist, and that, Susie had learned, was deliberate. She remembered their last year at Brown clearly. A classmate, Joel, quiet, smart, someone Tate had worked with more than once, who Tate kind of enjoyed working with in class, came out as gay midway through the semester. No announcement, no drama, just honesty. After that, Tate stopped sitting near him, stopped responding to Joel's emails unless absolutely necessary, switched study groups, crossed the quad rather than passing him on the path, avoided him. Tate viewed Joel like one would view a disease. Ironically, that's what happened to many gay men in the 1980s and 1990s. Tate once brought up the gays in reference to Mark and said Mark wanted inside Noah's pants. Tate had said it so matter-of-factly that there was no margin to believe otherwise. Tate hated Mark because he was gay, Noah had told her. Tate hated Mark not with anger, with quiet disgust masked as indifference until it touched Noah or rested its hand on Noah's shoulder or waist. Tate noticed it in the smallest shifts. The way Noah's attention lingered a second too long when Mark spoke. The faint smile barely there, but enough that Tate had never seen directed at anyone else. It crawled under his skin, slow and suffocating like something alive. People thought jealousy was loud, explosive, obvious. They were wrong. Tate's was quiet, precise. It lived in the way he watched Noah from across the room, tracking every glance, every word, every breath that didn't belong to him. Because that's what it was, his. Noah wasn't just someone he loved. Noah was the axis everything else spun around, the one constant, the only thing that made the rest of the world feel aligned. And Mark had the audacity to disrupt that, to look at Noah like he was something to be wanted, to speak to him as if Tate wasn't even there. Tate's jaw tightened as Mark laughed, the sound too easy, too comfortable. Noah laughed too. That was worse, that was unbearable. Didn't Mark understand? Noah wasn't available, not really, not in any way that mattered. Tate felt it then, that sharp, familiar twist in his chest, not quite anger, not quite fear, something deeper, something colder, possession. Mark could have anyone he liked, it didn't change anything. Noah was Tate's, he had always been, and Tate wasn't going to let anyone forget it. Susie had clocked it immediately. Tate never said a word about it, never explained why Joel's present was removed from his life, never justified the distance. He just withdrew, like the guy had become something unsanitary, like proximity itself was the problem. That was Tate's pattern. If something challenged the version of the world he'd decided on, he didn't argue with it, he didn't interrogate it, he removed it, and that was what made Noah's position so unbearable. Because Tate didn't see Noah as gay. Funnier still, Tate acted like the idea of Noah being gay was unthinkable. His good, kind, blonde-haired buddy could never be a fag. Susie hated that slur just like Noah flinched every time Tate spat it out like the word was venom. His opinion on Noah didn't allow or make room for the idea or question of Noah's ambiguous sexuality. Tate believed most ardently that Noah wasn't gay. He had it Brown threatened to rearrange a bully named Nate's face if he ever called Noah a fag. Nate targeted Noah because Noah's masculinity was more subtle than mainstream masculinity. Tate was very masculine and no one mistook him for being gay. Tate wasn't one to allow anyone, friend or stranger, to hurt Noah in his presence. He had hugged Noah after Nate fled the atrium, and Tate took Noah's hand, reassuring his buddy that Nate's words were stupid and untrue. Tate never spoke of gay people or used the terms when around Noah or said directly to Noah, not because he was enlightened, but because categorizing Noah that way would force Tate to reconcile two truths he refused to let exist in the same space. So Noah stayed exempt, an exception, a loophole, a companion who didn't count as gay. Susie felt sick thinking about it. Noah loved a man who would not sit next to an openly gay classmate, a man who used slurs and then pretended the subject was beneath discussion. An oblivious straight man could share a bed, a life, a history with a gay man and still draw an invisible line that Noah was never meant to cross. Tate's avoidance wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion, it was a rejection by omission. And the cruel irony, the thing Susie couldn't escape, was that Noah, of all people, would be the one most hurt if Tate ever decided to really look at what he was doing. Because Tate hated loudly enough for Noah to protect himself by veiling his sexuality from his oldest buddy. Tate's bigotry was silent since the topic rarely came up in conversation. He hated quietly enough, which didn't push Noah away. That was the part that never added up, and Susie had turned it over in her mind more times than she could count. It didn't come from Tate's parents. It didn't come from Aunt Julia or Uncle Joey, Terrence's siblings, so it must have been from the athletic atmosphere Tate spent his time in since middle school. The Blues were openly progressive, educated, the kind of people who donated quietly and talked plainly. They had gay friends long before it was fashionable. They'd lived through the AIDS crisis with their eyes open, not averted. They knew names, they knew loss, they spoke about it with respect, not pity. There had never been a joke at anyone's expense in that house, never a slur, so Tate's homophobia hadn't been inherited, which meant it had been learned elsewhere. Susie suspected it came from a colder place, not ideology but experience. Adolescence, boys, locker rooms, schools where cruelty was loud and ritualized, where masculinity was enforced through silence and exclusion, where anything soft or different was punished not with lectures but with looks, with distance, with the threat of social death. Tate had learned early what not to be and how to hate any behavior or individual who didn't live up to that expectation of toxic manliness, and unlike his parents, Tate didn't process things emotionally. He processed them structurally. He noticed patterns, he noticed consequences. Somewhere along the way he must have concluded wrongly, rigidly, that queerness complicated life, that it disrupted order, that it invited attention he didn't want. Luckily, Tate's interests, career, and love life were heterosexual and acceptable in the circles he ran in as a teen and as an adult. Tate had an emotionally avoidant personality, not because he was taught to hate, but because he taught himself to avoid emotionally charged conversations unless it had to do with Noah's attentions and access to Noah's body. Tate only had meltdowns and emotional tantrums about Noah or birthdays. Tate would stomp his foot, shatter miniatures, break windows, and smash through doors if anyone kept Noah away from him or if Noah played hard to get. Tate must have absorbed the message from his homophobic, sexist peers when he was young that certain identities came with mess, vulnerability, unpredictability, perhaps death, and Tate had no tolerance for that. He built his life around control, around clean lines, around certainty. Homophobia for him was a secret passion. It was sanitation, which made it all the more chilling, because beliefs born of fear can be argued with, beliefs born of ignorance can be corrected, but beliefs born of a desire for order, those calcify. They don't rage, they don't justify themselves, they simply persist unquestioned. Susie thought of the small cyan-colored key. Old, unlabeled, kept without explanation. Tate didn't get his homophobia from love or hate, he got it from learning that some things he didn't understand about others was and that was what nearly broke her. Because Noah had spent years earning space he already deserved, loving someone who might one day turn that same warmth into cruelty. And here he was, smiling at her like the world was simple, like kindness was still enough to keep him safe. Tate reached again, this time more deliberately. His arms stretched across the bed, palm open, fingers curling as if he tried hard enough he could pull Noah back by muscle memory alone. The sheets were cool now, the warmth fading fast, and that made something ugly twist in his chest. "Noah," he muttered, voice rough with sleep. "Nothing." Tate exhaled sharply and rolled onto Noah's side of the bed, pressing his face into the pillow without thinking. It still smelled like him, clean soap, something familiar and grounding, and the irritation flared hotter because of it. Noah had been right here, had chosen to leave their shared bed, again. Every night since Noah was 18. Every single time his Noe left the bed before Tate woke up, doing God knows what instead of prioritizing Tate's needs to see his buddy present when he woke up in the morning. Tate hated the predictability of it, hated waking up alone when he hadn't gone to sleep that way, hated that Noah never stayed long enough for morning, like daylight changed the rules, like closeness was only allowed under the cover of sleep. His hands clenched the sheets. If Noah wanted distance, Tate wished Noah would just take it outright. Don't crawl into his space. Don't let Tate wrap himself around him like it was normal, like it meant something, while leaving behind warmth that made absence feel intentional. It felt like being chosen and rejected in the same breath. Tate sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair, jaw tight. He didn't let himself think too hard about why it bothered him so much. He framed it as annoyance, as a disruption, as a habit. But the truth pressed in anyway, uninvited and unresolved. He reached for Noah because some part of him expected Noah to still be there, and waking up to empty space, again, felt like something being taken from him without consent. Tate swung his legs over the side of the bed, irritation simmering low and constant, already bracing himself to see Noah awake in the kitchen, smiling as if nothing had happened. Like leaving hadn't mattered, like Tate hadn't noticed. Susie was in the kitchen with Noah when Tate finally appeared. He looked put together, dressed, satisfied and calm in that effortless way that made it impossible to tell how he'd woken up. He nodded at Susie, poured coffee and picked up the paper like nothing in the world had shifted overnight, like he hadn't reached for someone who wasn't there. Tate was silently seething. Noah had slipped out of their bed before dawn again. For the past 6 years it had become an infuriating ritual. Every morning Noah quietly escaped while the house was still asleep, leaving Tate to wake to cold sheets and empty space beside him and the familiar ache of loneliness and rejection. It wasn't simply the absence that infuriated him, it was what it represented. Noah never stayed, Noah always left. The habit ate away at Tate's composure, stirring a possessiveness he despised in himself and a jealousy he couldn't explain. Every pre-dawn departure felt like Noah was choosing distance over closeness, as though the night belonged to Tate but the morning belonged to everyone else. The thought lingered long after he got out of bed, souring his mood and feeding an insecurity he refused to acknowledge. But Tate would rather have swallowed broken glass than admit any of it. He was too wealthy, too proud, and far too emotionally guarded to confess that the empty side of the bed bothered him so deeply. Instead, he buried the hurt beneath irritation, convincing himself he was merely annoyed by Noah's habit, when in truth he simply hated waking up without him. Noah glanced at him once, just a flicker, then went back to talking to Susie. Easy, polite, normal. An hour later Tate had settled into his chair by the window, newspaper spread wide, absorbed enough to give them space without officially excusing himself. Noah took Susie through the house properly this time, explaining where things were, what they'd changed, and tasks they never quite got around to fixing. He spoke with familiarity, ownership, like this place was a shared organism he knew by heart. When they reached the hallway again, Susie slowed. "Hey," she said lightly, "can I ask you something, just us?" Noah nodded without hesitation. "Yeah." They stepped into the unused room, Tate's room, though it barely felt like it belonged to anyone, and Susie closed the door partway, not locking it, just enough to carve out privacy. She didn't dance around it. "Did Tate ever ask about your 18th birthday?" The room felt colder. That birthday had mattered, Susie knew it. Noah's friends knew its significance for Noah and Tate's relationship. It wasn't about legality or milestones, it was about the shift. The line crossed quietly. The night Noah stopped being a kid who slept beside Tate without consequence and became someone who learned abruptly to leave before morning. Susie swallowed. Did you want him to ask? Noah hesitated this time. I didn't want him to notice, he said finally. That felt safer. Safer than what? Susie didn't ask, she already knew. Susie absorbed it in silence for a long moment, then frowned slightly. But Tate found out, she said, about how it affected you. Noah nodded. No, he has no clue. That surprised her all over again. He noticed I was exhausted, Noah went on, that I stopped wanting to nap with him. One night he asked if I was avoiding him. Noah exhaled. So I avoided him emotionally. Recently I told Tate that I left his room years ago because he climbed on me in his sleep, which made it hard for me to rest, that it wasn't anything anymore. And Susie asked. He apologized, Noah said quietly. That stopped her. I had to tell Tate some reason why I left his room after my birthday, and the dream activity seemed less volatile than admitting my feelings for him or the Emily gets fucked by Tate incident, I said, cringing. Tate doesn't apologize easily, she said. I know, Noah replied. That's why I remember it so clearly. Noah looked down at his hands. Tate said he didn't mean to cross a line, said he didn't realize it bothered me that much. He promised he'd try to stay on his side of the bed. A pause. He meant it too for a while. Susie's chest tightened, not with relief but with something more complicated. So he knew, she said slowly. He knew you were uncomfortable, he knew something had changed. Yes. And he still wanted you there, Susie said. Noah didn't answer right away, then softly, yes, Tate hasn't liked sleeping alone in his own bed since we met. He's afraid of the dark, I assume. I asked him about it and he changed the subject. Tate made an excuse that his reasons were silly and embarrassing. I let the subject drop and it's been 10 years since I talked about it with Tate. That was the part that unsettled her most. Tate hadn't been oblivious. He hadn't been cruel when he hurt Tate or terrible in that moment either. He'd listened. He'd apologized. He'd tried, at least briefly, to correct himself. It meant it wasn't simple neglect or ignorance. It meant Tate was capable of care and avoidance at the same time. Capable of apologizing without asking the harder question, capable of fixing the surface problem while refusing to look at what lived underneath it. Susie shook her head slightly. God, Noah. Noah gave a small, tired smile. He did what he could handle. And that, Susie realized, was the quiet tragedy of it. Noah hesitated, then added almost as an afterthought, almost. He even joked about it, Noah said. Asked me how good he was in bed while Tate was asleep. Susie blinked, then she laughed quick, surprised, a little incredulous. Of course he did. Noah smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting. Once he knew I wasn't hurt or traumatized by his dreams, he tried to lighten the mood. Yeah, like if he could make it a joke, it didn't have to be anything else. Susie shook her head, still smiling, but there was an ache threaded through it. Tate's humor, deflection wrapped in charm, an apology softened by levity, a way to acknowledge without examining. That's very Tate, she said. It was meant to make me comfortable, Noah replied, and it did, kind of, he shrugged. At least it told me he wasn't angry. Susie sobered, her laughter fading into something gentler, but it also meant he didn't ask the follow-up. Noah nodded. Exactly. I noticed the last time at dinner, Tate bumped my leg by accident while he ate, Susie smiled. Did he do it on purpose? I didn't laugh, he didn't deflect. He likes to get my attention, he must have accidentally touched you, Susie giggled. Footsie is where that pressure shows up most clearly. When he can't hear I love you, he looks for it under the table. His foot finding mine isn't casual, it's a bid. If I leave my feet there, if I give him my attention for even a second, it reassures him that he still has me. That the words are missing but the connection isn't gone. If I don't give him my body at night, if I'm not where he expects me to be, if I pull my feet away during footsie, his focus snaps back to the words I don't say. The absence gets louder, he feels it physically, and the more he feels it, the more desperate he becomes to reclaim proximity. So footsie becomes a substitute language, a way for him to feel loved without hearing it, a way for me to give him just enough to keep him tethered. When I deny the words, he chases the touch. When I deny the touch, he obsesses over the words I don't say sometimes. That would destabilize him, Noah explained. Susie was quiet for a long moment. So he's regulating without knowing why, she said. Yes, I answered, through routine, through proximity, through access. I didn't dress it up, through me. He doesn't know what BPD is, I added. He just knows what keeps the fear quiet and what makes it roar. I have pushed him to see doctors, I said. That part I don't avoid. Susie looked at me. He went to see a doctor about his sleep last year, I continued. They diagnosed him with a sleep disorder. That was something he could accept, concrete, physical, and non-threatening. I paused. It helped a little, at least it gave him language that didn't feel like blame. And therapy, she asked. I nodded slowly. Every 6 months or so, when he's calm, when things are stable, when he's in a good place, I bring it up. Carefully, I frame it as support, not as fixing him. And he won't go, I admitted. No defensiveness, just a fact. He shuts down or deflects or says he doesn't need it. Anything that suggests his way of loving might be examined feels dangerous to him. Susie sighed. So you try when it's safest. Yes, I said. I don't push when he's already dysregulated. That would backfire. I looked down briefly. I try when there's enough stability that the idea doesn't feel like an attack. And you keep trying, she said. I do, I replied. Even knowing he may never say yes, I didn't present it as heroic or hopeless, just ongoing. I'm not pretending I can replace professional help, I added quietly, but I also can't force insight on someone who isn't ready to look at it. Susie nodded, understanding the tension. You're walking a line, she said. Yes, I answered, between helping and holding too much. Susie's question hung there, and when I answered this time, I changed the word because it fit better. After I moved to the guest room, I said, the day after my 18th birthday, I swallowed. That wasn't just hard for him, I continued. It was his worst nightmare come true. Once I closed that door, everything in him unraveled. He stopped sleeping, I said. When he did, it was broken, waking every hour, packing the hall, stopping outside my door like he was afraid I'd vanish if he didn't keep checking. My voice tightened. He needed to see me breathing, needed to know my body was still in the house. Susie's eyes filled with tears. He became desperate, I went on. Not angry, desperate. His voice changed, softer, needier. He kept asking what he'd done wrong, if he could fix it, how he needed to get me back. I shook my head. He couldn't tolerate not having access. It wasn't just emotional, it was physical. He'd sit on my bed when I wasn't there, I said quietly. Touch the sheets, wait for me to come back. I exhaled. My body being elsewhere felt like abandonment he couldn't reason himself out of. Susie whispered, that sounds unbearable. It was, I said. For him, it felt like the ground dropped out, like love had been revoked overnight. A pause, and for me, it was the moment I realized how much my physical presence regulated his sense of safety. I looked up at her. That was his worst relapse, I said, because it was the first time he faced the idea that I could remove myself and he had no control over it. Susie said nothing. That nightmare, I added softly, never really left him. It just learned how to stay quiet when I stayed close. Susie took my hand when she asked it, her fingers tightening slightly. When did you know about his nightmare? I didn't pull away. His mom told me before I moved to Brown, I said. Not in detail, but enough to know something had gone very wrong when I left his bed. Tate sometimes has nightmares. Talia suspects they are about people Tate cares about who left him. Susie listened without interrupting. And then Talia told me more, I continued. She said she'd seen Tate after I moved out of his room. I swallowed. She said he was distressed, crying himself to sleep every night, totally miserable, unhappy, not talking to anyone, just hollow. Susie's eyes never left my face. He wasn't himself anymore, I said. She said he was a shell of who he'd been. My voice dropped. Because Tate believed that when I removed my body from his bed when I left his room, it meant I loved someone else, not him. I tightened my grip on Susie's hand. That was his truth, I said, not a fear, a certainty. I shook my head slowly. He didn't think I needed space. He thought I'd chosen someone else and erased him without saying it. Susie breathed in sharply. Talia told me that's why he collapsed like that, I went on. Why were the nights so bad? Why did he stop functioning? Susie inquired. I looked down for a moment, then back up. She wanted me to understand what absence did to him before I left again. I paused. And I did, I said quietly. I just didn't understand yet how permanent that imprint would be. Susie squeezed my hand, still listening, still there. I added that part too because the timeline matters. Tate was depressed and secretive after my 18th birthday, I said. During that whole nightmare meltdown, I looked down briefly. I asked him about it later at Brown, asked what had happened to him. He wouldn't talk about it, not a word, he just shut it away. Susie listened closely. That's when Talia stepped in, I continued. When I was packing up my boxes to leave for university, she pulled me aside. I swallowed. She asked me to watch over her son, not casually, seriously. She didn't dramatize it. She explained it. She told me why I needed to watch out for him, I said. She told me what he'd been like after I left his room, how withdrawn he became, how unhappy, how he stopped talking, how he carried it quietly so no one would see. I shook my head. That was the first time I understood how deeply it had affected him, but I still didn't know about his borderline personality disorder then, I added. Not really, I didn't have language for it, I just knew distance broke something in him. Susie waited as I finished the thought. I didn't put it together until years later, I said quietly. The last time I physically removed my body from him was the first night we moved into this apartment a few years ago, I exhaled. One night of separation and the same patterns came rushing back. That was when it clicked. That's when I understood it wasn't just history, I said. It wasn't just teenage attachment, it was a cycle. I met Susie's eyes. That was when I finally understood what I'd been stabilizing all along, I said quietly, because once I saw it I couldn't unsee it. I hadn't realized how damaging it was, I admitted. How life-threatening it felt to him when I moved to another room. Susie didn't rush me. At the time, I thought I was setting a boundary, I said. I thought I was taking up space. I didn't understand that to Tate it wasn't space, it was annihilation. I swallowed. My body being elsewhere didn't register as independence, it registered as abandonment. I shook my head slowly. I didn't know then that removing myself physically would dismantle the one thing keeping him regulated. My voice tightened. I didn't know it would hollow him out, that he'd stop sleeping, stop talking, stop functioning, that he'd believe completely that I'd chosen someone else and erased him. Susie squeezed my hand. If I'd understood the cost, I said, I would have handled it differently, not necessarily stayed but prepared, supported, made sure he wasn't alone with it. A pause. I didn't realize how close to the edge it pushed him. I looked up at her. That's the part that stays with me, I said. Not guilt, but awareness. Knowing that what felt survivable to me was catastrophic to him, and I let the truth sit there, heavy but honest. I added it because that's the part that still aches. That's why I regret how I implemented my non-negotiables, I said quietly. Not that I had them. But the way I enforced them, I swallowed. I didn't understand what boundaries would initially do to him. Susie listened without interrupting. I demanded space like it was just a rule, I continued. A line I drew without explanation, without scaffolding, without support. I shook my head. I didn't know about his BPD then. I didn't know that for him separation wasn't a boundary, it was a collapse. I paused, then said the part I usually don't say out loud. When I hurt him cruelly after the heat went out at his home, he wouldn't forgive me unless I promised that we'd never sleep apart again, even if we were fighting. My voice softened, and when I broke that suddenly, absolutely, I didn't realize I was breaking more than an agreement. I was breaking the one thing he believed meant safety. Susie squeezed my hand. I thought I was asserting autonomy, I said. I didn't know I was pulling out the foundation that held him together. A breath. If I'd understood then what I understand now, I would have done it differently, slower, with care, with help. I looked at her. I don't regret needing what I needed, I said. I regret not knowing the cost to him when I took it. Susie asked carefully, what did you say during the power outage all those years ago that was so cruel? I sighed because even now it sits wrong in my chest. He said unkind things and I wanted to get even. I said something I knew would hurt him, I admitted. I told Tate that one night when Maya and I were sharing the bed with him to stay warm, Maya slept between us, and that she and I fucked on our sides, spooning while Tate was asleep on the other side of the bed. I said it so he'd know how I felt on my 18th birthday. Susie's eyes widened slightly, not in shock, more in understanding. He felt betrayed, I went on. Not just jealous, betrayed. I shook my head. To him it wasn't about the act but that she shared the bed and space we'd kept for ourselves. It was about proximity, about being there, about believing his body, his presence, meant no one else would try to take me from him right in front of his eyes. I swallowed. He believed Maya being between us meant he'd been replaced while he was right there, I said quietly, that I'd chosen someone else in the exact space he thought was safe. Susie exhaled slowly, so it confirmed his worst fear. Yes, I said it because I wanted to take power back in that moment. A pause, and I regret it because I knew exactly where it would land. I looked down. It wasn't just cruel, I said. It cut straight through the one thing he trusted. The next afternoon, Susie and I met at the cafe to talk about the last meltdown Tate had. The one that happened was right after we had a few fights. It occurred 2 months after our boundary discussion and Tate got angry. It was quieter there than usual, late afternoon light slanting through the windows. Susie wrapped her hands around her mug but didn't drink yet. She was waiting. That night, she said finally, what actually happened? I leaned back in my chair, staring past her for a moment. It was supposed to be simple, I said. We fought about where I was sleeping since my things were still in the spare room and I hadn't remembered to walk my boxes back to his room. I wanted him to start sleeping in the other room, I told Susie. I said I needed space, that I wanted the freedom to bring girls home, and hinted the extra space would provide benefits for him too. I shook my head. I said it to Tate bluntly, too bluntly. Susie didn't interrupt. He went off the deep end, I continued. Not yelling, not like before. I paused. That's what scared me. What did he do? She asked. He unraveled in a way I'd never seen. It terrified me, I said quietly. I nodded because that pattern didn't start at the apartment. It started much earlier. When Tate felt threatened after my 18th birthday, I said, he'd sneak into the spare bedroom anyway. I paused. I wouldn't invite him, he wouldn't ask. Susie's expression tightened. I'd go to sleep alone, I continued, and wake up with him already there. Slid in quietly sometime during the night, like if he could just get his body back beside mine, the fear would stop. I shook my head. Sometimes I didn't even know when he came into the spare room. And that was when you were trying to create distance, she said. Yes, I replied. That was his response to it. My voice stayed even, but my chest felt tight. If he sensed I was pulling away emotionally or physically, he'd reassert proximity, not aggressively, desperately. Susie was quiet for a moment. So, sleeping near you was how he stabilized himself. Exactly, I said. It wasn't about permission in his mind, it was about survival. Being close meant I hadn't left, that the nightmare hadn't come true. I looked down at the table. At the time, I thought he was just ignoring my boundaries, I admitted. Now I understand he was responding to panic, to the belief that if he didn't act, he'd lose me entirely. Susie exhaled slowly. That doesn't make it okay. No, I said, it explains it, it doesn't excuse it. I let that distinction sit there between us, important, uncomfortable, and long overdue. I answered slowly because this was the part that changed how I understood everything. When we were adults, I said, if I caught him slipping into my bed, I'd tell him no. Sometimes I'd make him leave. I paused. I thought he listened. I thought that meant he respected it. Susie swallowed. But I figured out before we moved into the Rambler that that wasn't why he stopped, I said quietly. Her throat worked as she asked, then why did he? Because his parents were there, I said. There were adults in the house, limits he couldn't cross without consequences. I shook my head. It wasn't my boundary that stopped him, it was supervision. Susie's eyes looked shocked. His parents went to dinner, and we argued about Mark and my sleep arrangement with Tate. She whispered what happened. He didn't accept it the way he had before, I said. He argued it, circled it, tried to outlast it. I exhaled. That's when I realized the structure that used to contain him was gone and I was the only thing left. Susie pressed her lips together, fighting emotion. That must have been terrifying, she said. Susie waited. She didn't rush me, didn't fill the silence. She just stayed there, bracing herself. When I said no, I finally managed. When I told Tate he'd be sleeping in his room from now on, he didn't accept it. My throat tightened, I had to stop, breathe. He'd never hurt me before, he hasn't since, I said, almost like I was trying to convince myself. That's why it took me so long to understand how serious it was for Tate. Susie's voice was barely audible. How? He blocked the doorway, I said. Not aggressively at first, just stood there, too close. He blocked the door so I wouldn't ignore him or control my movements. I swallowed. He wouldn't let the conversation end, wouldn't let me try to put out the fire. Susie's hand flew to her mouth. He kept insisting we talk it through right then, I went on. Kept stepping closer every time I tried to step back. His voice was calm, but his body wasn't. My eyes burned. It felt like he was trying to overwhelm me into giving in. And when you didn't, she asked. I nodded. Saying it out loud still felt unreal. He put his hands on me. Susie froze. He did what? She said, shocked. Not the way people usually imagine, I said quickly, needing to be precise. He didn't hit me, he didn't strike me, I swallowed. But he grabbed me and pulled me towards him so I would leave. He's really an emotional child, Susie, he didn't mean any harm. Her face was drained of color. His hands held me still so he explained himself, but I wanted to leave. He held my wrists, I said. Hard enough that I couldn't pull away. I went still after he said it. The room felt like it tightened. He said he was going to bed with me whether I wanted to or not. Susie's shock showed on his face. When I initially said no, the look on Tate's face was something I'd never seen before. He was terrified of sleeping alone. I tried to leave his bedroom to de-escalate the situation, but he wouldn't let me leave. I moved toward the door, but he pulled me towards the bed. He wouldn't take no for an answer. We wrestled on the bed and rolled around for a few minutes until Tate won. Once I was pinned, he said he wouldn't let me up unless I considered staying. He was so used to winning that he thought he was always in control. He hasn't done that since I told him it wasn't okay. He forced you to sleep there against your will, Susie was shocked. It was the only time Tate ever gave me no choice. I could tell by the look in his eyes that he was terrified to sleep alone. His behavior wasn't okay. I knew that and made sure he knew it the next morning when I told him that if he ever forced himself on me or held me against my will in his room, our relationship was over for good. His arrested development, BPD, and emotional immaturity hinder him from easily understanding consent and respecting boundaries. He's much better now, and I won't let him push my boundaries anymore. Good for you, Noah, Susie touched my shoulder to comfort me. Setting boundaries and expecting respect in your relationships is important, Susie said gently. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, Noah. Noah looked at her, grateful for the reassurance. Susie offered him a warm, encouraging smile. As his friend, she wanted him to understand that healthy relationships required mutual respect, honest communication, and boundaries that were honored by everyone involved. Seeing Noah begin to recognize his own worth made her hopeful that he would continue to grow more confident in advocating for himself. Susie couldn't help but smile. She was proud of Noah and how much he had matured over the 6 years since they had first met.